Hello, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon session. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Bertha Coombs. I'm a healthcare reporter at CNBC. And this afternoon, I am joined by Joel Bervell, who is the host of the Dosed podcast. He's also a Ghanaian-American medical student. He's got other projects going on. I guess he gets along without sleep. I don't really know how you can do so much. Next to him is Megan Ranney, who is the Dean of Yale Law School, Yale Medical School?
Yale School of Public Health.
Yale School
But I could, it all intersects.
I guess I'm so used to, I used to go to the Yale Law School dining room and the library because they were my favorites. They were close. That was one of the things that was in the brain. And then Austin Chang, who is the author of Gut, an Owner's Guide, and he will be talking about that in the subsequent session. He is also the Chief Medical Officer of Endoscopy at Medtronic, which I don't know how you can do that so young. You guys are all so accomplished. I am quite in awe of you. You know, we're talking today about misinformation. Obviously, it certainly came to the fore when it came to healthcare misinformation during the pandemic and vaccine hesitancy, but it's not new. You know, there was a 1905 Supreme Court case of Jacobson versus Massachusetts, with a man sued the state saying he shouldn't have to have gotten the smallpox vaccine. The High Court upheld the state's right to say that in the public health interest, people should get vaccinated. And then, of course, in the 1950s, we actually saw coming from medical people and from the healthcare systems, Bruno Bettelheim, the issue of autism, which is one of the things that has run for a long time when it comes through myths and disinformation, where he attributed autism in children to what they called refrigerator mother. It's always the mom's fault, right? Then we realized, no, this is really a neurodivergent problem. And you hit the 1990s and you have Andrew Wakefield, who put forth the theory that autism was caused by measles vaccines and that it was the mercury in the vaccines, which has been debunked and scientific evidence has shown is not the case, and yet that persists. So I wonder, as this is not something new, and yet it feels like it has been supercharged. What is it that drove you, I'll start with you, Austin, what is it that drove you on social media to try to combat this?
I mean, quite honestly, I'm a gastroenterologist by training, and so through my medical training, I'm starting to see patients come into the emergency room, come into the hospitals, because of what they were learning through media, through social media, and kind of being misled. And that's really what, kind of piqued my interest on like how people were receiving their medical information, who was vetting this information, before it was being broadcast on, media channels or through social media. And I thought to myself that maybe potentially one day I could also be an authority in the area that I was trained in to be talking about these topics and help debunk a lot of these myths so that people can actually have accurate information going to seek their, doctor's care and whatnot.
Megan, you really were omnipresent for me during the pandemic, helping explain what was happening. And it had to be hard as a physician because we were all learning in real time.
So yeah, I'm both an emergency physician and a public health researcher, and was on the front lines during the COVID pandemic, both from the perspective of being an ER doctor and from helping to craft our state response to COVID-19, and then on the federal level, helping to think about how we could get enough personal protective equipment to my colleagues on the front line across the country. And it was one of those things that felt in many ways like an everyday emergency department shift, where I'm taking care of folks, I have incomplete information, I have to gain trust and do the best I can to explain where we are, what comes next, and then to reset as we get more information, right? Any of you who have come to an emergency department know you walk through the door, we take your vitals, you wait, you wait a little more. Maybe you get some labs drawn. At some point, we come and we explain what the labs mean. Maybe we say we have to go send you for radiology tests. We hopefully come and explain what those mean. And then at some point, we have to synthesize all that information and say, this is my best guess about what's going on, and this is what I think we're going to do next. And then if you get admitted to the hospital, you're going to have more discussions with healthcare providers. If you go home, you might do other things. Same thing around COVID-19, right? We were in the midst of this once in a lifetime, at that point, hopefully it stays that way, pandemic, and didn't know much. Brand new virus. We were all trying to figure things out as quickly as we could. The scientific infrastructure was working as fast as it could, but we were all living in this paucity of information and guidance, and so tried to approach it in the same way that I would approach a discussion with a patient or a family member in the emergency department, which is translating the science and the knowledge out into terms that are both comprehensible and actionable, whether on the part of an individual, a family, a community, or a policy maker. And I think, for me, one of the things that I think is quite special is that ability to bridge kind of the medical and the public health science, and then put it all in layperson terms that my mom or my husband could understand.
And yet, when you talk to people, they still will say, I'm not sure I believe you. I mean, I had a family friend who, and apparently this was some sort of viral thing that was going around on social media, that I'm actually allergic to people who are vaccinated.
Yeah. So that's where I think it's important for more of us to be out there sharing good information. Those types of misinformation, which is information that's not quite true, or frank disinformation, which is lies being spread with a kind of malevolent intent. There are a lot of people out there, and there's a lot of money behind testing and spreading those. There's not as many of us out there spreading good information and doing it in ways that use some of those same marketing techniques that the purveyors of disinformation use. So if you don't know what is true and not true, and you see a meme that's shared by someone that you trust, you don't necessarily know how to sort out whether or not to believe it. So you're going to then go to maybe your trusted sources around you. And again, if they're sharing that meme, you're going to believe them. And now you, Bertha, come in and tell them they're wrong. What makes them trust you rather than trust the person who shared the thing that they saw on Facebook or on what was formerly known as Twitter, or
TikTok now.
Or on TikTok now, yeah. It's interesting. I have two kids, and although I have given them subscriptions to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and so on, they get almost all of their news from TikTok and from Instagram Reels. And it's where I think the two of you especially have done some really interesting work, is in thinking about how do we spread reliable health information on those media in ways that are both, again, comprehensible, but also actionable, to translate the emerging science in terms that both you can understand, but that matter to the folks that are seeing it.
Joelle, so what is your approach when you get on there? Do you wind up debating people, or do you find when you put something out, do you get backlash?
Yeah, so I really started creating content during the COVID pandemic, and it really was because there was things I was seeing or learning in medical school that didn't really make sense to me. So I remember hearing when COVID first came out, it was 2019 when I started medical school, so 2020,
Wow.
we were entirely virtual, basically, for my first 2 years of medical school. And I remember we kept hearing that COVID was more likely to be in Black patients, or Black people just in general. And it didn't make sense that we framed it in that way, because it made it sound as if COVID, biologically for some reason, was more likely to affect Black people. When in the reality, it was because of sociopolitical things. So whether it's communities of color are more likely to be frontline workers, or to actually not be able to have telemedicine, or be able to take work off, different things like that that are connected to history.
Or like in the Bronx, where I live in New York, and the Bronx was one of the worst areas hit because of the density of the population.
Exactly. But we didn't really talk about it in that way in medical school. We left it as communities of color more likely to get COVID. And so I started taking to TikTok to talk about the ways in which I thought we weren't talking about things accurately, especially when it came to issues of race. And for me, the way I approached it was by taking things that people maybe had heard about before and reversing it. And so especially when it comes to race, we have all these myths that people still believe about race. In the opening session, I talked about one study from 2016 that showed that half of medical respondents, medical students, and residents still believe one false biological belief between Black and white patients. Those were false beliefs like Black people have less nerve endings, Black people have thicker skin, Black people feel less pain.
Yeah.
And there was a subsequent study that was done that showed that those that believed those false beliefs were less likely to give adequate pain medication compared to other patients as well. And these types of myths exist. And the interesting thing is when I post these types of videos debunking these myths, I get a lot of comments saying things like, I believed this, or my professor just taught me this last week. And so I actually started off by doing what I called story times on TikTok.
Well, what was the reaction from professors? Because obviously, I mean, I don't know, no offense, but there are some doctors who, when you challenge them, don't like it. Because I appreciate the fact that you have spent a lifetime and sometimes gone into tremendous debt to gain your expertise. But, you know, as a patient, we also have questions. And, you know, sometimes as a woman of color, I find I want to make sure that you aren't just going by this old myth. You as a doctor have myths too.
Yeah. Yeah, and for me, I think one, I focus really heavily on studies, and so that's why it's so important for like more diverse studies to be out there. But then two, I just told it from a storytelling perspective. So one of the stories about skin thickness I told was that my friend Cameron came home from school one day, and we've been doing suturing lab. This was during my first year medical school. We've been in the suture lab. He came home, and the professor he was with said that you choose the needle size based on the race of the person. And he asked me, does that make sense? And I was like, that does not make sense. And so that's how I framed it in my video as my story time. And it launches a whole tirade of conversation in the comments that then allows people to then debunk it in the comments, but with subsequent videos as well. And so I think my approach is really not necessarily challenging per se, but like questioning. And I learned early on to ask why. I always say the 5 whys. When you keep asking why we have something, whether it's a system, whether it's one thing that we've kind of taken for granted, we get down to the root issue of it. And so I was always the kid in my class asking, why do I do it like this? One example is we always learned, early on we learned about like cyanosis, which is when the skin turns blue. I kept looking at myself and saying, I'm not gonna turn blue, what's gonna happen to someone that looks like me? And I ended up raising my hand and asking the professor, and I felt really weird doing it because at my medical school, myself and one other student were the first 2 Black students at our school, even though there'd been 4 classes beforehand. And the professor had a great answer. He said, look at your mucous membranes, you can look at your eyes, you can look at your nail beds, all these other areas. But I kept wondering to myself, if I hadn't raised my hand and asked that question, when's the first time someone would have recognized that this maybe doesn't look the same, you know, or that the myths that we have aren't necessarily true?
Right. Well, you know, there are also issues with women's health that are
Absolutely.
similarly not well covered, right, in training for a lot of doctors.
Absolutely.
You know, I was talking to Austin earlier, and as I was thinking about this, we talk about social media in terms of things going viral. You know, and as someone who, as a kid, always had colds, it was one of the things that I learned that it was like, you know, if it's a bacterial infection, we can give you an antibiotic and we can put it out. If it's a virus, you know, coronavirus, cold, you know, obviously we now have some antivirals, but there really aren't that many antivirals. You kind of have to ride it out. It's much harder to deal with it. And it seems that with misinformation as well, it's harder to deal with it because it somehow becomes, I don't know, a core belief for people, and there's this core distrust. Does that make you think about what's going on with medicine in the same way that you asked that question? Does it make you think, is there something that we could be doing to try to help build trust?
Absolutely. I feel like in some ways that example of virality almost feels a little hopeless, like you have to write it out. But my take is that we should probably be creating our own viruses in some ways. Because in my opinion, I think Joel and I probably have experienced that virality in some cases can be a calculated outcome. You know, as long as you understand what drives the platform's algorithms and what contributes to, you know, whether or not something goes viral, like watch times and engagement, you know, people commenting and liking on that piece of content, then you kind of know how to craft your story, how to storytell in a way that your content goes viral and can reach a wider audience. And I think that's something that, you know, when we're talking about these marketing skills that, you know, other people who are putting out a lot of disinformation know how to use. for us, it's not taught in medical schools, it's not taught in residency, and it's something that really should be. So in some ways, I feel like our education system is failing us in not providing us with those tools and focusing so much on just the science and the biology, but actually we need to think about the rest of kind of the landscape of healthcare.
Or in schools of public health,
Yeah.
right?
Health.
So that's one part. And then there's another, which is there's actually this whole field now of infodemiology. So thinking about, to your point around thinking about it as a virus or an infectious disease, thinking about the epidemiology of information in the same way that we think about the epidemiology of a disease, right? COVID-19, we all watch those track boards about infections, hospitalizations, deaths, how it spreads. We can do the same thing for the spread of bad or good information. And then there's a growing science about how we vaccinate ahead of time against susceptibility to bad information, how we combat misinformation in real time, and how we create credible messengers, so spread good viruses perhaps, or protective strategies, as opposed to just, to your point, as opposed to just leaving. So it's partly about getting more good information out there, flooding the zone with good information. It's also about teaching people how to evaluate those signals about whether or not something might be manipulated, misinformation, or frank disinformation, and having ways to get in and combat that when we see a rise or at the beginning of a viral spread of something bad and harmful.
Yeah,
Do you feel like it's working?
No, because we don't spend enough money or time on it, and we don't train people in it. So A, infodemiology is brand new. B, and I'm looking around this room, I see many health communicators who I've worked with for years in this room. Most of us do it as volunteers. We're not getting paid to go on TV, to create our Instagram Reels, to create TikTok. You may have some sponsorship deals at this point, or some kind of, there are some ways that you can monetize, but there's no service that's training us, creating messages for us. So this is done out of a sense of goodwill for humanity, because it's something we care about, rather than because it's our job. So no, I don't think we're doing enough.
And I think part of the reason, too, is there needs to be more networking and connection with other institutions that have control. So think about the social media companies themselves, right? During the COVID pandemic, they did do a good job of kind of adding on like labels and things to send it to the CDC. But I think where they failed was while they found trusted messengers to kind of amplify, they weren't doing a good job of actually making sure that, how do we make sure that this algorithm rewards people for accurate information as opposed to sensationalist information. Austin was just talking about like we know how to like game the algorithm away. Like right now what it's based on is how long is someone watching the video, how many likes does it get, how many shares does it get on and off platform, right? And what's gonna get the most shares on things? Something that's gonna make you scared or fearful. Things that are accurate often don't make you feel that way, right? And so I've always said, and I've told this literally to TikTok, I've told this literally to YouTube and every single platform, how can we reward people for creating real, accurate information and make that a part of the algorithm as opposed to rewarding just clicks? And that's a big shift because that changes the model. Because right now, how do social media companies get paid? Advertisements. What do they want? What are they in a war for right now? Attention and eyes. And so it's this kind of two-edged sword where you want them to do good, but it kind of goes against their business model of actually making sure they keep the eyes on the platform.
Interestingly, kind of two kind of additional anecdotes in a small study. So, you know, we worked with YouTube, with the National Academy of Medicine, World Health Organization, and CMSS, the Council of Medical Specialty Societies. We worked to create a series of criteria for credible messengers, credible health messengers, to apply basically the equivalent of a blue check on YouTube, and then elevate those messages. That has yet to be evaluated, and we certainly know there's lots of mis and disinformation on YouTube, despite our creating that program. Then there have been some partnerships between public health agencies and influencers. The Harvard School of Public Health did a recent study working with mental health influencers to try to share accurate information around mental illness and mental health. And they unfortunately found in this partnership that when the influencers shared this accurate health information, those videos got fewer views and less engagement than the influencer's normal content. And so then the influencer would start to be kind of put down in the overall algorithm. So it actually, there was an actual disincentive for the influencers to share accurate, non-fear-based information. So we've got a long way to go to figure out how to do this in a way that's reliably engaging.
And if I can add, also a lot of the key opinion leaders and trusted voices are at institutions that don't incentivize social media use.
I'm trying. As a dean, I'm trying, yeah.
I was at an academic center advising the health system on this, and we were trying to, write in ways to, factor this into like the tenure and promotion policies. There's also been some discussions about, reimbursement potentially for work on social media. So there's a lot of work that can be done. And I know that, it's not just the platforms and the issues around the social media, platforms themselves, but also, educating, each other on how to do this. And there was an effort a couple years ago that I started, the Association for Healthcare Social Media. We tried to position it as the first kind of professional society devoted to educating other health professionals on how to use social media effectively and responsibly. So how to go viral, but also not how to fall into all these pitfalls. There might be two of my co-founders in the audience, Natalie Crawford and Pamela Maida. And we worked with the platforms directly. We, tried to treat it as an academic study, helped fund, some research devoted to healthcare and social media. And so, there's these types of efforts that can be done to help, rectify the problem.
One of the things I wonder about in the age of generative AI, they train on social media, they train on everything that's on the internet, and is there a way to have a discussion with these platforms and these new, OpenAI or any of the others that are coming out to try to balance it out? Because once the machine learns something, it's hard for it to unlearn it.
It's an interesting question. I'll say I'm actually most worried with AI around the easy creation of misinformation, even more than it's feeding into false corpuses of data. I'm worried about how easy it's going to be to say, create me a message to dissuade people from taking the measles vaccine if they are Black women aged 20 to 30 in Detroit, and put it in a voice that's going to sound like someone that they trust, right? And so there's a huge potential, that's the part about AI that really worries me with communication, never mind also the deep fakes and the possibility of, you probably experienced this too during COVID, right? That people would take little clips of what you said out of context and then turn it into this false narrative. Certainly we saw that done to Fauci and to others a lot. And that becomes even more concerning in the world of AI. I don't know what the two of you think, but.
I mean, I think generative AI is definitely a big concern. Another thing that I was just reminded of was I remember the Wall Street Journal had done a study where they made 100 different fake accounts, each one focused on a different subject. And they showed that, in some ways, the algorithm kind of predicts what you want to see, and people can focus on sports or pets or something like that. But also, if you're focused on sadness, it can lead you down this really, potentially harmful rabbit hole as well. And so I'm concerned about AI in that aspect as well.
Yeah, and I think, AI definitely does have an opportunity, if used correctly, to source accurate information and weed out misinformation. But it's like what Dr. Rainey said, that it can at the same time it can amplify bad messaging at the same time too. And so for me, when I'm thinking about AI, I'm always about what's the input? You put trash in, you're gonna get trash out, right? Then also thinking about do we know how it's actually working within the algorithm to lead to that end product? And oftentimes we don't, that we just kind of put it to work and we hope that it works in our favor. And so really, I think what we need to do is better understand how would AI be used in social media in order to accurately go through and weed out misinformation, but also making sure that's not weeding out the good information. Right now, a lot of platforms, what they're dealing with is a lot of creators that are creating content that's about, for example, abortion care, right? TikTok kind of bans the word abortion. And so many creators have to get very creative if they want to talk about accurate information that way. Even things like contraceptives. If you want to create information about that, when you write literally the word abortion or contraception, people will put different symbols in order for it not to get flagged by the algorithm and purposefully pushed down in terms of content. So that's what trusted figures have to deal with a lot of the time. And I can see AI, unfortunately, amplifying that kind of suppression of accurate information if it sees it as something that is inaccurate when actually it is good information.
as you talk, there's one more place where I think AI is concerning, and it's not necessarily around ingesting the social media false myths, but rather the printed stories, right? You guys have all seen the story about kind of how to make pizza and that Google AI told you to make it with glue and that kind of a story. And I know we've talked about this as someone who works in the media. They're going to take those kind of bad stories out there and maybe summarize them at that top of the search page. But also, it then results in fewer clicks for paid journalists. Your work gets taken and summarized. And so my worry is actually that it destroys the information ecosystem.
Well,
and
that's
that
that's already happened, and it's certainly an industry that is under stress at this point. But we've talked a lot about social media, and obviously that's what amplifies people's ability to spread misinformation. But I wonder about the germ of it, in the sense that I grew up, we had a family doctor. My parents trusted Dr. Wayne Gorton. We had that relationship. I don't know that many people have that relationship anymore. I mean, I know I had a doctor, fortunately, for 20 years, but she retired. And now it's hard for me to find a doctor that I can stay with, because every, physician group keeps shifting. And so I wonder about, you had trusted voices during the pandemic when they were going to communities of color and rural communities. They went to churches because those were communities that people trusted, and that was how they were able to do vaccinations and get people to really talk about their fears and interact. That isn't happening, it seems to me, within the health system with your primary care doctor necessarily.
Yeah, I feel like this highlights a bigger systemic issue of, the visits with our clinicians are shorter and shorter. I think a lot the frustration among the health professionals and burnout, it's also being manifested in, dismissive care. And when people are not getting their questions answered or not feeling like they're heard or valued as patients, then they lose trust in the system, and it kind of feeds in this vicious cycle. And I think it's on us who are visible on social media and active on social media to also kind of re-inject a little bit of humanity. I personally, my approach is showcasing a little bit of my own personal life. I know not everybody likes that approach or is willing to share that much, but I try to show that I'm also human and I have the same questions and concerns that everyone else has. And hopefully that part of my aim is to just bring that distance closer back together between physician and patient.
Absolutely. And for me, I think what I try and do on social media to gain that trust back is by talking about those pain points. I don't think it does any good to hide them. The fact, and I'm very honest about it in terms of both how healthcare is changing. As I mentioned at the beginning, I talk a lot about race. So I talk a lot about how there's a history in the United States of inequities and injustices against the Black community. I have a whole series called Hidden Medical History. And for a long time, I thought I was going to be scaring people away from the healthcare system. But I found that in the comments from the message I got from people, they were instead saying things like, I'm so happy you talked about the Tuskegee experiment,
right.
Henrietta Lacks, Mississippi appendectomies, forced sterilizations, because it helps me understand that when I go to the doctor, I need to advocate for myself and actually find a doctor that I can be a partner with. And so it helps people realize that they need to find and create those connections. It shouldn't just be a one-off with your physician. It should be a long-term relationship where you can, the patient-provider relationship, where it's not kind of this power dynamic anymore, but you're building something, building a relationship with someone else, and understanding that there have been harms in the past, but by working together, we can rectify that.
And the last, I would say it's also about the team approach, that not every physician, nurse practitioner, social worker, physical therapist is going to be out there on social media. And so I think it's thinking about, for those of us that do have voices, whether in traditional or social media, how do we use those for good to create trust, to help amplify accurate messages in a way that then makes our colleagues' jobs easier? Because as you said, the life of a healthcare provider in the United States right now is really, really tough.
Very stressful.
It's super stressful, and folks are leaving bedside care in unprecedented numbers, physicians, nurses, et cetera. partly because of misinformation and workplace violence as a result. I know that I and any of you in the room who are practicing providers experienced this during COVID, having patients get literally angry at you when you told them their diagnosis or tell you you were lying. And so that's something that is driving people out of the profession. So if we can step up as public health agencies, as communication organizations, as individuals, that then makes the environment better, which allows you to get back to that trusted conversation.
I wonder about, you all are very public, but have you encountered situations one-on-one? And sometimes with family members. I know I have a family member who had put out something that was quite specious about vaccines. And I pushed back, and she said, "Are you trying to trigger me?" And I felt better that it wasn't just me, her older cousin saying this, but some of her peers were saying, "No, sweetie, we don't think that's right." So I felt better that I wasn't the only one pushing back to say, "No, that's not right." So I'm wondering, I find it's really hard when it's family one-on-one. How do you deal with that?
So there's a skill called motivational interviewing that we use in medicine, kind of across health, which is around kind of starting by listening, creating a shared alliance around goals, rolling with resistance, using empathy, and I use that skill. I'm not going to get someone from 10 to 0, but I might get them from 10 to 7 in terms of what they believe or what actions they're going to take. It's true for COVID vaccines. It's true for the work I do on gun violence. It's true for talking about wearing sunscreen, right? We could talk about any of a bunch of different topics. So for me, that's the technique, is one of starting with connection and then slowly finding those spaces where you can engage in a conversation that allows challenge. Sometimes it's not worth the conversation, though, and so for the sake of the relationship, I back off and maintain my relationship with my loved one until the time where they are ready to engage in that motivational interviewing conversation, which is part of the technique, too.
I'd say outside of family members, I have had one-on-one, conversations with people, and you just never know what their motivations are.
Right.
And sometimes people have a very civil conversation with you, and they'll take bits and pieces of your answer and broadcast it elsewhere and kind of put it out of context, and that can be really concerning. And even fellow physician colleagues of mine, also have opinions about vaccines, and it can be a really difficult conversation because they have also this medical background that you have to navigate too.
Some of our physician Facebook groups are a little terrifying, so yeah.
And you don't know what they're trying to get out of this.
Yeah.
Really, I wonder about that. You talk about making it, in a sense, part of public health to be out there doing information. But do you get flack from your colleagues saying, "Hey, come on, that's not what your job is. You're supposed to be treating people. What's this, you going on TikTok?"
Yes.
Well, I can
As a med student, I'll bet you have stories. Yeah.
I was gonna speak, as a perspective, I'm a medical student,
Right.
still, right? And so I'm in my last year, and I started this during my first year of medical school, and it was really fascinating. I think for the most part, I got really positive feedback from people, because a lot of the things I was talking about were things that no one else was, that were true and that were research-based, but no one else was talking about. But I have had physicians who have said, I'll give one example, actually. So I don't know, how many people here have heard about the GFR equation? Okay, some people. So
Terrific.
Yeah.
I'm impressed.
That's more than usual. So GFR stands for glomerular filtration rate. It's a measure of how well our kidneys work. If you have a high GFR number, your kidneys work well. If you have a low GFR number, your kidneys don't work very well. For decades, there's actually been a racial correction for this equation for black people, and only for black people.
Why?
Why? Exactly. When you go back to the research, you look at it, and essentially, they showed a small cohort of black people, found out there was a higher level of muscle breakdown protein called creatinine. And so they said, let's multiply this equation to actually reach equity. That was the idea, to be equitable. What that ended up doing, though, was making it seem as if you're, all else being held equal, if you're black versus white, the black person would have better kidney functioning. That made it harder to get access to kidney specialists, harder to get diagnosed with chronic kidney disease, harder to get a kidney transplant. It wasn't until 2021 that that equation was changed, and that a new marker, cystatin C, in addition to creatinine, was used. And in 2023, the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network actually went back and basically reevaluated and said, if you've had this race-based equation used, we're going to readjust it for those patients. Actually, I've been making videos about this all during this time, and I've actually been getting a lot of pushback from physicians, some physicians who said, no, this race-based equation should exist because of X, Y, and Z reason. And I found myself having to defend and say, well, we know race is a social construct, that there is no biological reason for race. It's a social construct, meaning that you can't look at their genes and choose out someone's race. You can look at ancestry, but you can't look at race specifically. But there was a lot of people kind of going back and forth. And so I felt validated when the equation was changed and all these things were happening. But I actually had a patient reach out and said that she'd seen my videos and she'd been sending them to her sister who had chronic kidney disease during this entire, over the past 4 years. And when that news came out that they could adjust it, she actually reached out and said she sent it to her sister. Her sister took it to her doctor, and she got moved up 5 years on the kidney transplant list. And so these are moments where I'm like, as much as the pushback comes, when you put out accurate information like that, which is there's misinformation, there's the myth of black excellence in terms of black superiority and muscle mass and all these types of things. But when you can debunk these things and actually cause people to understand their own health, it allows you to go to the hospital, reach that patient-physician relationship, have better kind of trust overall, and actually be able to get better care overall. So.
Yeah. And I would say there are lots of trolls out there, whether within or outside of the medical community. It doesn't discriminate. We've got folks that are healthcare providers who are equally as trolly as people outside, and they're out there, and it's part of you expect it with the territory if you're out and you're public. But there are tons of benefits to being on social media. The professional dialogue that happens, the sharing of new studies, the dissection of the studies and their strengths and weaknesses. I find it to be one of the most terrific educational tools that I'm part of, and it's been a way to find collaborators and to work with communities that I might not have otherwise worked with as well, folks that are not part of the public health or healthcare profession, to create alliances around sharing better information. So to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, yes, there's a negative side, but there's tons of positive from being online as well.
Yeah, I faced pushback for different reasons along the way. So I started on social media over a decade ago on Twitter initially, and at the time I was a trainee, and a lot of the faculty mentors were saying, this is a waste of time, this is an embarrassment to our community, you should get off the internet. Lo and behold, years later, they're all getting on the internet themselves on social media. And I kind of switched from platform to platform. So on Instagram, there's a whole different culture and identity, and I sort of adapted to that identity and got some flack for that. Then when TikTok came along in 2019, I started adapting to that model, and my content is a bit sometimes humorous and funny and dancey. And you can imagine some people had opinions about that. But at the same time, I saw the benefits of this. There were certain videos of mine where I was able to highlight aspects of gastroenterology or less publicized procedures that reached millions of people and led to people getting care that they otherwise would not be aware of at all.
So you went with your gut.
Oh.
Yes, it was a gut feeling.
But I had to get that dad joke in there. So, on that note, let's open it up to questions. There are folks with microphones around the room who will come by. Let's go with the gentleman in the back first.
Thank you all for doing this. This is great. In terms of misinformation, my question has to do with women's health. And I'm told that there's been an assumption for a long time in the science of women's health that women are just smaller men. Is that starting to shift? Is the science starting to be addressed? And will there be new studies, do you think?
Well, let's be clear that it wasn't until the early 1990s that it was mandated that women be included in clinical trials. So any medications that we take that kind of were tested and approved by the FDA prior to the early 90s didn't necessarily ever have to be tested on us as women. And women are also systematically excluded from many studies because of fears about us being pregnant and the fear of teratogenicity or of harming the fetus. And that means that we're not eligible then for many studies. So there's just a lack of data. And just as there have been a lot of assumptions around how race intersects with biology, there have been a lot of assumptions around how biological sex as well as gender intersect with everything from drug metabolism to the presentation of disease, with heart disease being a classic example where we present slightly differently in terms of symptoms compared with men, to cancer, and I could go on. So yes, and it's complex, and again, it goes back to history and the way in which our fields were run by men, and it was thought that it was risky to include us in studies. So I'm grateful that that is starting to shift, long overdue.
And yet even, I was reading something the other day about the Alzheimer's drug Leqembi, which has an average score supposed to sort of delay the progression of Alzheimer's by about 27%. Well, there was an update to the study that showed actually for men it was actually 42%, and somehow for women it was only 12%, which was astounding to me given the fact that women are the majority of people with Alzheimer's.
And who knows, right? Like that there's tons of basic biological studies that need to be done to figure out why we respond differently to different medications, what the genesis of disease is, and so on. So there is so much work to be done.
Mm-hmm. And I can just speak from the medical student standpoint of like what we're learning right now. I feel like we're starting to introduce these conversations a little bit more, but there's so much more to be done still. On the Dose podcast, I had an interview with Dr. Matthew Gulati, who talks a lot about women's health, the need for it in medical schools. And I remember leaving that podcast and thinking, I didn't learn about any of this in my medical school classes still. And so there's so much more work to still be done in terms of conversations about the differences and inclusion in clinical trials and making sure that we're doing more work there to reach gender equity overall.
All right, and do we have any up close? We'll get you to next. I think we have some. Did someone raise their hand over here? The gentleman here in the blue shirt? Okay. Really? Well, we've got doctors in the room if anything happens.
That happened yesterday, and we actually had someone faint during our presentation yesterday morning, the
Oh, my
altitude.
goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But she was sitting next to a fellow ER doc, so it was okay. She was fine.
As a clinical psychologist, I was fascinated with the Harvard work creating mental health influencers. I'm not surprised it didn't work because mental health isn't sexy. To be a little depressed, to be a little borderline, to be a little OCD, that's more sexy. Which brings me to my question, how do we market health? How do we create influencers that my granddaughter at 9 years old is going to say, it's cool to exercise, it's cool to eat right, what have you?
I feel it's actually kind of building, to me, social media is an extension of real life, so it's actually building a human connection through social media. And actually, there are a number of really big mental health influencers who do a fantastic job at kind of putting themselves out there, showcasing their own personality, and through that kind of lifestyle content, able to inject a little bit of information and knowledge and give people some information that they, I don't want to say subliminally, but in some ways kind of package it in a way that you might not otherwise. It's not just throwing data at people or just throwing information at someone.
And
I think celebrities are as important because I think about Simone Biles's very visible issues with her mental health during the last Olympics, and Michael Phelps coming out and talking about his
John Fetterman this morning in his discussion here. So I think there it's about authenticity. I think one of the things with the Harvard study is that these were influencers that weren't typically talking about mental health, and they tried to insert it, and that's not what their audience was expecting, versus like PsychMD, who does brilliant work around kind of ADHD and communication. That's her entire personality online. And so I think part of it is making sure that it's congruent. And then our job is to help provide that accurate information to folks that want to communicate well. The last thing I'll say is you've commented about the algorithm. Again, we don't learn in med school, in public health, in clinical psychology about how that works. And it's not that I expect every health professional out there to be doing this, but there needs to be some part of the curriculum that teaches us how to think about how to communicate well and or ways to create those partnerships with brands or content creators or marketing specialists.
Yeah, seconding both what was said here, and I think also working with celebrities, authenticity, all of that's so important. And then I think like packaging it in a way that just feels like exactly what Austin was saying, like normal, right? Like going through life. And so a popular trend, if you're on social media that you'll have definitely seen, is like a day in the life, or like get ready with me, or like people putting on makeup. And I've now seen people putting on makeup and talking about their depression at the same time, which is like, whoa, what? But it's effective because people are already watching the makeup tutorial. If you add in a real just life story of yourself in that moment, people want to feel authentic. They don't want to be marketed to for anything, even if it's about health. They want to be educated in a way that feels authentic.
And if we can get front here, thank you. I know you're in a tough spot.
Just like our country is divided politically, I feel that one thing we're not looking at, there's a big influencers of alternative medicine versus traditional medicine.
Yeah.
And a lot of these
Yeah.
anti-vaccines came from the alternative world. So how do you feel about that?
So I think it's because of that people feel not listened to by their doctor, and they feel hopeless. They're suffering, and they're not getting answers. And so these wellness influencers, who have existed, as you said, forever. Snake oil salesmen have been a thing since the dawn of time. The FDA was created in part in order to restrict the sale of opioid-laced cough syrup and cocaine-laced
Soda.
thing, right? Like, this stuff has been around forever, and it's because people don't feel like they're getting answers or help in other ways. So it's absolutely present in this, not that wellness and lifestyle kind of change are bad things. Yes, you should be out in nature and taking walks and eating well, but it substitutes for accurate information. Specifically in the realm of women's health, I highly recommend looking at Jen Gunter's work, Dr.
She
Jen
does great
Gunter.
work.
She does outstanding work kind of debunking many of these purveyors of truly harmful supplements and actions by women.
Or steaming your private parts.
Steaming your private, like all kinds of weird and not useful and, again, potentially harmful stuff, but that women use because they feel otherwise ignored, going back to your question about women's health. So to me, that, again, it's the answer. It's the absence of something better, and it's the fact that they make a lot of money off of doing it. So there is a real profit motive for them to sell their supplements and whatever else.
And when they make a lot of money, they have a whole marketing engine that can keep them going, and it's challenging. Yeah, and the people who subscribe to some of those things and not at all to kind of what we're taught conventionally, it can be difficult. You have to move the needle kind of very
How
gradually.
difficult is it when the purveyor of this information or the supplements is actually a medical doctor?
Yeah.
I mean, I find that really
God help.
difficult,
You want to?
right?
It's very challenging. And when you try to open up a conversation with some of these other physicians, they immediately block you, restrict you. They don't want to hear it because they're likely profiting off of whatever
Right.
message or whatever they're selling.
Yeah, and oftentimes then that has to be taken to a higher level, to like the actual social media platform level, to figure out what's happening here, because it's hard when there's that many people that are supporting it. But one thing I think that this is a symptom of too is, and I always say this, one of the most important things I've learned in medicine, medical school, beyond just like medicine, is actually how do you look at information? How do you understand what is accurate, what's inaccurate, who the players are, why they're pushing out that specific information there when you read research papers? And I think our country does not do a good job of teaching us at young ages of how to critically evaluate information and data. And I think that starts way younger. And so I talk to a lot of elementary, middle school students about social media, but my talks are about how do you figure out if this is true or not? And so I start my talk with like giving out a lot of videos that are false information, but they seem really accurate, you know? And I ask people, how many people in this room agree with that? And a lot of people raise their hands. And then I go down into the study and say, well, this was actually from this person. Here's why it's not true. Here's the accurate thing. But I think we need to do more of that just in our society, of allowing us to be more critical thinkers of what is accurate, what's inaccurate, in just like data.
That's one of the critical issues in media,
Yep.
to be able to look at media and say, okay,
Epic Times, not so much. CNBC, way better. Yeah.
thanks, I hope so. I hope so. Okay, there's a gentleman here in the blue shirt.
I got it. Thanks. Yeah, I don't have any great ideas or solutions to this intractable problem. But as I listen to the strategies being talked about for using social media to counteract the demons out there, in some ways it sounds a little bit like, what caliber gun should we put on the Maginot Line, as opposed to maybe, is there an asymmetrical way to go about this? And maybe it's something like through the clergy and social and local community efforts, because the demonologists are operating with 6th and 7th generation technology, and those of us who are the anti-false information, what was the word? Anti-false information. Anyway, we're trying to figure out what technology is even plausible or feasible.
So I'm going to give a shout out to the Rockefeller Foundation for an example of this. So during COVID, they funded something called the Equity Vaccine Initiative. Many of us in the room worked with them, working in a few core cities across the United States to create partnerships with anchor institutions, community-based organizations, with the goal of trying to share accurate information about why you should get vaccinated, the fact that it was free, how to get transport there, et cetera, et cetera. And in doing that work, we found that actually our first task was not training the community-based organizations up to share information out. Rather, it was educating the leaders within those community-based organizations around some of these myths themselves. But we then found that once that was done, those members of this community-based organizations, these community-level leaders, served as extraordinary representatives, translators, creators themselves, not necessarily on social media, but in those one-to-one conversations. So I love the Maginot Line analogy, and I do think that we have to think outside the box. I think I'm going to look at Caitlin Chattalina, who's sitting here, who has the Your Local Epidemiologist Substack, another great example of creating evidence and disseminating information in ways that then can be used and shared by others. So I think we've got to be trying different things as well as flooding the zone.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to echo that and say that, it's not just social media efforts alone, working in isolation. It's everything around that, down to elementary school education and, teaching people that it's not that, science has to be, the definition of misinformation, I believe, from what the Surgeon General put out in his social media guidance, referred to what best available evidence at the moment and just that dynamic nature of science we saw during the COVID pandemic. As more evidence emerged, things changed. We as a society haven't been able to appreciate that medicine is dynamic and
Right.
we have to roll with it.
Well, that's a great note on which to end. Austin, Megan, and Joelle, thank you all for the work that you do.
Yeah.
Thank you.